All right, I think we can get started. It's 2:02 right now, and there are over 30 participants right now, and more attendees are coming. So hello, everyone. Welcome to ethics seminar series. This is John, the seminar coordinator. And together with me is Ms. Kathy Medley. She's our communication specialist, and Kathy and I will be today's moderator. And we are excited to have our speaker, Professor Greg McFarquhar, joining us from Oklahoma. Just so you know, the seminar is being recorded and it will be later published on our YouTube channel. Please be free to ask questions. You can do so by sending us a text message, or we prefer you raise your virtual hand and we will unmute you. So let me give a brief introduction about today's speaker. So Dr. Greg McFarquhar is the director of the Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies. And he's also a professor of the School of Meteorology at the University of Oklahoma. He has published over 190 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and is a fellow of the AMS and AGU. His research focuses on cloud microphysics, and he has led or participated in 28 airborne field campaigns in 5 different continents. He is the current vice president of the International Commission on Clouds and Precipitation, and former chair of the American Meteorological Society's Committee on Cloud Physics. So let's welcome the speaker, and I will give the board to Dr. McFarquhar. And just one more thing. So there might be a thunderstorm affecting the Oklahoma in Norman. So if there is a sudden interruption during the seminar, don't worry about that, because Professor McFarquhar will call in with his phone, and I have his slides ready. If it happens, it would be just a short break. But we hope we will get this and go through this eventually. Okay, so Professor McFarquhar, please proceed.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I regret that I'm not able to be out in Maryland visiting with everyone, but I'm happy that we still have a chance to talk. So today I would like to talk about how we use in-situ cloud microphysical observations obtained by aircraft in order to quantify the microphysical properties in clouds and to learn more about the processes and uncertainties in representing those processes in models. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge the members of my cloud physics group at the University of Oklahoma who are depicted here. And I would also like to make several other acknowledgements, in particular to the Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, NASA, and NOAA, who funded the research that I'm going to present today. The names in red are former students of mine who are now working at different institutes. And the names in white are some of the different investigators at many different institutes that I've collaborated with on this analysis. Okay, so as an overview of what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, I'd like to give a bit of a motivation. And I'd like to point out that a lot of people think of aircraft observations as some sort of ground truth. But in reality, there's uncertainties in any form of observations, just like there are uncertainties in model representations and remote sensing retrievals. Then I would like to talk about some of the different techniques that we use to make measurements of cloud properties, and then to talk a little bit about some of the sources of errors that exist in those quantities. And then I'd like to conclude by talking about how we can take some of these measurements and use it to improve representations of processes and models, and then talk a little bit about some of the process studies that we've conducted using some of those in-situ measurements. So first of all, to motivate this talk, I want to talk about why it is we care about microphysics. So I'm going to start by looking at a picture of rush hour in Chicago, Illinois on Lakeshore Boulevard on Groundhog's Day in 2011. So I think most of you being from Maryland, I don't have to emphasize to you that there can be large amounts of precipitation that can be associated with winter storms. And you can see in this particular storm in Chicago, the forecast didn't work very well. And what we do is we use numerical models in order to produce quantitative precipitation forecasts. But these models require accurate representation of processes such as rhyming, aggregation, deposition, sublimation, sedimentation, and many other microphysical processes. And those in turn require knowledge of the size, shape, and phase distributions of cloud particles. So if I have to explain to an incoming graduate student what my research involves, we basically take images of ice crystals and water droplets, such as shown here. These are observations that were obtained in this winter storm that affected Chicago in 2011. And what we have to do is we have to use this information from these images to give us information about what are the properties in clouds and what in turn this tells us about the processes that are occurring in clouds. Or put another way, here is an example of a vertical profile of some cloud particles that were obtained in an Anvil in the tropics just off the coast of Darwin, Australia. And again, what we use is we use these images to try and help us better represent clouds in weather and climate models. So how do we, to give you a bit of a perspective, let's ask ourselves what models need from in-situ data. So, this is a much simpler scheme than some of the ones Liang runs out there at Maryland, but I can illustrate the point with this figure here. So what a model scheme does is it predicts, say, the total amount of mass in a number of different hydrometeor categories. It might also predict 2 or 3 moments, such as also maybe the number of different components, but I can illustrate this process looking at a very simple example of the Goddard mixed phase scheme. So what this scheme does is it predicts the total amount of vapor, the total amount of ice crystals, the total amount of graupel, snow, cloud water, and raindrops in a number of different grid boxes. So that's the total mass in about grams per meter cubed. And then what the scheme does is it transfers mass, or sometimes number, between all of these hydrometeor categories. And it's very important to know about this mass transfer because it affects the amount of latent heating or cooling, which in turn feeds back on the kinematics and dynamics that affects not only the evolution of the storm, but also the amount of quantitative precipitation forecasts. Now, what these schemes need is they need information about the microphysical properties because it affects the rate of these mass transfers. So it needs things like what is the size distribution, how many particles there are of different sizes, since we can't represent all of the different processes going on in different sizes of particles. This is frequently represented by a gamma distribution. So we need to know things like the intercept, the slope, and the shape parameter. We also need to know about how the mass of ice crystals or snowflakelets varies with the diameter of the particles. We need to know about their fall speed, and we also need to know about the single scattering properties because that in turn affects the radiative heating and radiative cooling that again feeds back on the evolution of the system. So what is it that we need to know about cloud microphysics? We need to know measurements of things like size distribution functions. We need to know about the phase, whether it's ice, liquid, or mixed phase. For ice, we need to know about the shapes of the ice crystals and the aspect ratios of the components of those ice crystals. We need to know about the single scattering properties. We need to know how much total water there is because that is predicted by the model. We need to know the total number concentrations because that is frequently predicted by the model. And we need to know information about the fall velocities. And not only do we need to know that information, we need to know that information in a wide variety of different locations. So I like to show this slide here because it really tells my life story. all of the blue squares show where myself or members of my group have gone around the world to make measurements of cloud properties, mainly using aircraft, but also on some ship-based campaigns. And the key thing is that cloud properties vary depending upon where they're formed, what height they're at in the atmosphere, and also in their geographical location. So hence, to measure the cloud properties, we need to go to different areas in the world. And it's just like an analogy. If you wanted to measure a palm tree and understand how it grew and developed, you wouldn't take a look at trees, say, in Maryland. You'd have to go to Hawaii or San Diego. And just like if you want to measure a palm tree, you don't watch it grow for 30 years. Similarly, when we conduct these observational campaigns of clouds, we do statistical sampling, where we look at clouds at a variety of life stages or growth stages to try and get more information on how they grow or evolve. Well, it's quite complicated to make measurements of cloud particles. And the reason is because their sizes and their concentrations can vary over several orders of magnitude. So the type of particles we need to measure, they can range in size from a cloud condensation nuclei that is a size of about 0.1 microns, and maybe there's about 1,000 of those particles per cubic centimeter. And then we need to worry about raindrops, which are 5 orders of magnitude larger in size of a millimeter or 1,000 microns, and the concentrations are only 1 per liter, or about 6 orders of magnitude less. And then you have additional complications because snowflakes can be even larger, and they can have a variety of shapes. Hence, it's not surprising that we have many different techniques that we use to make measurements of cloud particles. So here, I'm showing an example of one of the aircraft that we used in a field campaign we conducted out of Fairbanks, Alaska. And you can see hanging off the wing, we have a number of different cloud probes. These different cloud probes can measure different sizes of particles. Some are more effective at ice and water, and some also make measurements of their bulk techniques. So in order to figure out what's going on in the cloud, we have to integrate information from a lot of different cloud probes. So what I'd like to briefly discuss is the different ways we have of making measurements of these cloud properties. So to start off, one of the fundamental quantities that we measure is size distributions. And we can do this by a number of different techniques. One of the techniques we use is what is called a forward scattering probe. So here, basically, we have a laser that illuminates a sample volume, and as the aircraft moves in the forward direction, a number of cloud particles pass through this sample volume, and they cause light to be scattered, and most of this light is scattered in the forward direction. So we can use Mie theory to give information about particles that are about a size between about 1 and 50 microns to give information about the smallest cloud droplets. This works very well for liquid cloud particles because Mie theory converts the amount of light scattered in the forward direction, we actually use between about 4 and 12 degrees, into a particle size. For getting larger particles and ice, we use something that are called optical array probes. And again, here we have a laser that is illuminating a sample volume. But in this particular case, when the cloud particles pass through the sample volume, they cause a shadowing of an array of photodiodes that is in the other side of the probe here. And then by counting the number of photodiodes that are shadowed, we get an information about the typical size of a particle. And for those of you who don't know what a photodiode is, just think of your garage door or an elevator. It's basically a circuit where you have a light illuminating a detector, and if the light is blocked from hitting that detector, it knows that something is there. So that is why your garage door will not shut when there's an obstacle, and a well-designed elevator will not close upon you. Now, even more importantly, this photodiode detector is attached to a very fast response electronics array. So what that does is it allows us to get a two-dimensional image of the particle. So hence we can use sphericity or non-sphericity to determine whether we have liquid or ice. Now what this means, because the typical photodiode array, each photodiode corresponds to about 25 microns maybe in size, that means every time the plane moves 25 micrometers, we have to clock this array. So it means that we're clocking it over 1 million times a second. So hence we have very efficient ways to store the data and also fairly sophisticated codes to try and unpack that binary data into an actual size resolved distribution. We also have probes that make high resolution images of hydrometeors. These work very similar to your iPhone. It's just basically a 2-dimensional array, and we can get some high resolution images of hydrometeors that way. And then we have another range of probes which are called bulk probes. And rather than giving size resolved information, this might give us information about the total amount of liquid water that is present, or the total amount of water that is present, or maybe it just detects supercooled water, or information on the extinction. So here is an example of one of these probes, which basically brings all of the cloud particles into an inlet where they're subsequently evaporated, and then we can use something like a Lyman alpha hygrometer to measure the total mass of the particles. The key thing with microphysics measurements is that redundancy is the key. We have multiple probes and we assess the consistency of the probes. So if we have 2 size resolved probes, we look at whether they're consistent in their overlap range, which can give us information about how the probes are performing. This is very important because we're sending delicate electronics. We might be starting at 30 degrees Celsius at the ground, and then we're measuring ice clouds. We might go to temperatures as cold as -60 degrees Celsius. Hence, sometimes we have problems with these probes, so we want to develop algorithms for detecting when those problems are occurring. And then we also do something which we call closure tests. So for example, if we have a bulk measurement of mass or extinction, we can integrate our sized resolved distributions, and hopefully we have agreement with our bulk mass, and that gives us more confidence in the quality of our measurement. So next, I would like to talk about sources of uncertainty in our microphysical measurements. And there's basically 3 major sources of uncertainty. One is counting statistics or statistical errors. Another is the variability in microphysics for given conditions. That is, if we always make measurements in the same conditions, we don't always have the exact cloud properties. So we need to characterize this variability. And then we can have what I call measurement errors. So this can be induced by maybe the location of the probes in the aircraft. We're not sampling optimum environment. Or maybe some particles, maybe large ice crystals are coming and they're shattering on the tip of a probe, generating lots of small crystals. So I'd like to discuss these different sources of error in turn by looking at some observations that were obtained by the French Falcon aircraft that is shown in the background here off the coast of Darwin in an experiment where we were making measurements of high ice water content clouds, which were composed mainly of small crystals. To show an example of the uncertainty error, here on this plot here, I have the number distribution function plotted on the vertical axis as a function of the maximum dimension on the horizontal axis. And what we do is we count the number of particles in different size bins and then divide by the sample volume to get an area of the concentration and hence the number distribution function. And you can see in this plot here that I have a number of error bars. And the error bar, by counting statistics, it's deemed to be proportional to the square root of the number of counts in that size bin that was used to compute the number concentration. Now, what we want to do is we want to compare this statistical error or counting error to the error of the variability that we can have in cloud properties in the same environmental conditions. So in this plot here, again, I have the number distribution function plotted on the vertical axis as a function of time on the horizontal axis for a 3-minute period in some of these oceanic MCS type clouds. And what you can see, again, in this plot, the error bars correspond to the counting statistics and how much these concentrations vary over this 3-minute period give us an idea of the EV error, or the error in the variability of the cloud microphysical quantities. And you see that they're comparable for this time period. But if you take a look at another period where we had higher ice water contents, you can see in this particular period here, the error in the counting statistics is much smaller than the air due to the variability. And typically what we see if we choose the appropriate type of probes, and if we integrate over sufficiently large bin sizes and sufficiently large counting periods, typically the counting statistic error will be smaller than that due to the variability. So we can essentially usually eliminate this statistical error. So next, what I would like to do is to talk about the measurement errors. I'm just going to see if I can get rid of this thing at the top, and I can't, which is, say, induced by the shattering of large crystals on the probe tips. So what happens here is you have a plane that is moving at about maybe 150 meters per second. So in a different frame of reference, that means these ice crystals shown here are moving towards the tips at 150 meters per second. So not surprisingly, what can happen when these large crystals hit the tips, they can shatter into many small pieces. These small pieces in turn may go into the sample volume where we can detect many, many small crystals. Obviously, this is not very good. So we have a couple of different techniques by which we can eliminate these shattered particles. First off, Alexei Korolev of Environment Canada has developed modified tips, which, still the crystals still shatter on these tips, but they're machined in such a way that most of the small crystals are swept away from the sample volume. And we can also do this using some techniques that were developed by Paul Field to eliminate the shattered particles from the data by basically looking at the inter-arrival time of particles. So in this plot here, I have the inter-arrival time plotted on the horizontal axis and the frequency of occurrence plotted on the vertical axis. And you can see basically two different peaks. The peak with the largest inter-arrival times corresponds to naturally occurring particles, which are distributed according to Poisson statistics, whereas those with the smaller inter-arrival times correspond to the shattered peaks, because when one large crystal hits the tip here and many, many small particles are generated, they're going to appear in the sample volume at similar times. So if we eliminate the particles in these shattered peaks, we can also eliminate these shattered particles. To show you an example that this is really real, I'm showing an example that was given to me by Alexei Korolev of one of these probe tips situated in a wind tunnel at NASA Glenn facility in Cleveland, Ohio. I hope that the transmission is fast enough that you're seeing the video, but basically you're seeing some of these large crystals hit on the tips, and you can see them being deflected into the sample volume. So this is showing that this shattered problem is indeed real. So to look at this, what we did is we did a field campaign where we put two identical cloud probes. These are two-dimensional cloud probes that measure particles between about 100 microns in size and about a millimeter. We put them immediately adjacent to each other on the same pylon, where one of the probes had a standard tips, which have lots of surfaces where particles can shatter, and the other has the modified tips, which are designed to deflect the shattered particles away from the sample volume. And then we can compare the number distribution function from these two different probes. So in this plot here, I have the number distribution function on the vertical axis, the diameter on the horizontal axis. The solid line shows the measurements from the standard tips with no algorithms to remove shattered particles. And the dashed line shows the standard tips with algorithms applied to remove the shattered algorithms. And what you see is that the algorithms do remove a lot of particles smaller than about 500 microns, which are these small particles generated by these shattering events. You can also compare that with the solid blue line, which shows the measurements from the probe with the modified tips with no algorithms applied. And what you see is that the modified tips remove about as many small particles as the algorithms. And another important feature to note is that both the algorithms and the tips produce minimal change for particles larger than 500 microns, which shows indeed we are probably getting pretty good measurements of the large particles, even if we're not applying the new probe tips or these shatter removing algorithms. And this is very important in assessing the quality of the data that you have from old cloud probe measurements. This would suggest that if you're using old measurements before the development of these techniques or tips, if you use something like the total concentration, which is more dominated by the smaller particles, you would have problems in using these data and would get misleading results. But if you use something that is more associated with the larger particles, such as total mass, maybe the algorithms are okay. So to illustrate this, I'm showing the ice water content that is computed from the modified tips in the vertical axis versus the ice water content from the standard tips in the horizontal axis with no algorithms applied to remove shattered particles. Each dot here represents a 10-second size distribution. And what you see is that there's about a 20% difference between the mass that you get from the modified tips and those from the standard tips, which suggests that you can get a reasonable estimate of mass from the standard tips because a 20% error in mass is probably less than the amount of error that you get in the calculation of mass when you go from a two-dimensional image to a three-dimensional rendition of what the ice crystal looks like. The one other measurement you can have can be associated with the location of the probes on the aircraft. So here I'm showing an example of some probes that we put on the NASA P3 aircraft in a recent field campaign that we conducted in the Southeast Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Africa, where we were looking at the impacts of biomass burning on this stratocumulus deck. Now, I wanted to show this contrast to show that we had two different pylons that were used in this experiment. You can see the one on the right, you can see the cloud probes are immediately underneath the wing of the aircraft. This is a Navy pylon that came equipped naturally with the P3 aircraft. We were very concerned that the location of these probes could mean that we're not sampling a clean flow, but rather we're getting a perturbed flow because of the flow over the wing of the aircraft. So a new pylon was designed where the probes were put much lower and further ahead of the leading wing of the aircraft. And then what we did is we took two identical probes, cloud droplet probes, which measure cloud droplets between about 1 and 50 micrometers in size, and we put them on the different pylons so that we could compare the size distributions. And we also switched the probes halfway through the field campaign so that we would make sure that any differences we saw were not due to the probes themselves, but were rather due to the mounting location of the aircraft. And here we show when we switch the probes onto the halfway through the experiment. But the key thing is here, and I just want to draw your attention to the plot in the upper left here, where I'm showing the total cloud droplet concentration in the vertical axis from one of these cloud droplet probes and the total cloud droplet concentration from the other probe. And what you can see is that the probes pretty well fit a good one-to-one line. And this result actually surprised us a little because we thought that the older version of the pylon was much worse than it actually turned out to be. The different colors represent the different pitch angles because we were a bit concerned that the flow could be different depending on the pitch angle. But the bottom line is that we didn't see a lot of, say, systematic discrepancies in measurements of either the cloud droplet number concentration, the liquid water content, or effective radius in the different locations. Well, next I'd like to talk a little bit about how we use in-situ observations to represent cloud properties in model. And what I decided to concentrate on was something called a mass-diameter relationship. So models for snow and ice have to recognize that snow and ice aren't perfect spheres. So typically we use a relation of the form mass equals some constant A times the dimension raised to the B power to represent a mass dimensional relationship. The representation of these relationships is challenged by the fact that there's a wide range of the shapes and sizes of ice crystals that are observed in situ. And typically what is done in a model is an A and B take a fixed value and are held constant, or perhaps are a function of simple environmental conditions. So when I had a new graduate student start with me a couple years ago, I asked him to look at what different A and B coefficients had been used. And what this plot shows here is B on the vertical axis, A on the horizontal axis, where the different colors represent ice clouds in different conditions. And what previous studies showed is that there can be a large spread in A and B for different environments. In fact, even in the same environment, such as Cirrus produced by large-scale ascent, you can see that there's a very large spread in the A and B values that could be used. So what I told my student is, well, what we could do is we could do a study and we could get a new point on here, which would be a new an A and B relation, and then we'd conclude at the end of our paper that it matches our data better than any of the others. But I said, in reality, that may not be helping the science advance very rapidly. Instead, what we decided to do was to develop a stochastic parameterization that would give a range of A and B values that maybe could be applied in ensemble models. And this may be more appropriate than using a single A and B value in simulations. So the questions I asked him to answer was, well, how do the parameters depend on environmental conditions? How does our uncertainties in the in-situ data that we just talked about affect the variability and uncertainty of such parameters? And then further, if we put this stochastic representation in a model, in an ensemble model, how does that scale up to uncertainties in model predicted fields? So our approach was to choose A and B coefficients that minimize the chi-square difference between bulk measurements of mass or coincident radar reflectivity and those derived from in-situ observations. And then what we did is we said, well, you minimum chi-squared, and anything within some plus or minus small delta chi-squared is an equally realizable solution. I don't have time to talk about all the details of how we determine delta chi-squared, but you can check papers by McFarquhar et al. 2015 or Finland et al. 2019 that give more details of this. So we took data from the MC3E field campaign, and we chose one case on the 20 May 2011 where convective clouds were measured in the vicinity of the Arm Southern Great Plains site with the University of North Dakota citation, and we took the radar data from the Vance Air Force Base, Oklahoma radar, which were matched to the location of the aircraft. And when we did this, what we showed here, this is a result of our study where we have B on the vertical axis, A on the horizontal axis, and these different colors represent our solutions that we derived and what the A and B solutions should look like of what is an equally realizable range of solution. A couple key things here is that the A and B solutions are highly covariable. As shown by the different colors, they did show some dependence on temperature. And in general, there's a greater range in A and B, which is correlated with less variability in cloud properties. So the next step was now to take this and put it into some ensemble simulations. And this was done in collaboration with McKenna Stranford of the University of Utah, who's now at PNNL. So what we did is he ran a case of this 20 May convective event where he compared the results from a stochastic microphysics scheme with that from ensemble configurations where we varied the A and B parameters stochastically according to some prescribed spatiotemporal autocorrelation scale. Again, I won't go into the details, but this is summarized in a paper by Judith Berner of NCAR et al. So to show the results here, I show the mean volumetric precipitation on the vertical axis as a function of time for a one-day simulation on the horizontal axis. The different colors shows the members of the ensemble simulations, and you can show that they actually vary quite minimally between the different configurations and that they're all quite a bit less than our two different realizations of the observations that we had. So to blow up a little and look at the spread in these mean volumetric precipitation estimates, you can see the red, blue, and light blue line here that are circled. You can see that the stochastic schemes produce a slightly greater spread in the precipitation than, say, we get by perturbing the potential temperature, but that they're less than what we get from, say, when we use different fixed ensembles where we just use a single A and B value and we vary it throughout the simulation. And it's also less than the spread that we get by varying the initial and boundary conditions. So at first, this would suggest maybe this ensemble approach isn't that important. But we also looked at the impact of the Anvil Cirrus, where we showed how the distributions of optical depth plotted on the vertical axis varied as a function of the ice-water path for both the stochastic simulations and the simulations where we had varying initial and boundary conditions. And what we saw, I should have put the color scheme back here, but you can see these color bars corresponding to the different stochastic simulations showed that tau, the optical depth, was actually much more variable for the stochastic ensembles than it was for the simulations where we varied the initial and boundary conditions, showing that the stochastic scheme captured a degree of the observed optical depth ice-water content variability that was not captured by the initial conditions, and this impacts cloud radiative forcing. And we suspect that when we put some stochastic simulations of fall velocity relationships into some of these models that a postdoc of mine is working on right now, we may also have a greater influence on the precipitation, which is probably more affected by the fall velocity relationships than the mass diameter relationships. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes by concluding by talking about some process-oriented studies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some observations that we collected recently over the Southern Ocean. So we had a couple of experiments that were conducted over the Southern Ocean in 2018 that were motivated by a climate problem. Namely, that if you look at the CMIP-5 models and you compare them to our best estimate of absorbed shortwave radiation from satellites, if you look at this box highlighted by the dashed line at the lower part, we see that the CMIP model clouds do not reflect enough sunlight over the Southern Ocean. This indicates too much shortwave radiation is being absorbed by the Earth system, and this can correlate with climate sensitivity. And we believe this occurs because clouds, particularly those low mid-level clouds that are, say, in the dry sector of the cyclones that race across the Southern Ocean, are fairly poorly represented in GCM and numerical weather prediction models. And this is most likely because the parameterizations of those models are more based on mid-latitude observations, which have many more aerosols, and probably that means that the supercooled water, the amount of supercooled water, is probably underestimated in the simulations due to the very pristine nature of the clouds there. So we conducted a couple of field experiments in 2018. One was called Socrates, which stands for the Southern Ocean Cloud Radiation Aerosol Transport Experimental Study, where we used the NCAR NSF-G5 to sample clouds, aerosols, and precipitation from our base of Hobart, Australia, all the way down to within about 400 miles of the Antarctic. In this project, we conducted 15 research flights representing 118 flight hours. We also had the research vessel investigator of the Marine National Facility of Australia sailing at the same time in the vicinity. We flew over them 4 times. We flew twice over the Macquarie Island site where the Department of Energy had a remote observing site. And we also released 109 dropsondes to characterize the boundary layer structure. So to give you a better idea of what was going on at this time, the yellow dashed lines here show the different flights that we conducted during Socrates. We typically design them in a north-south direction to try and get as far south of the oceanic polar front as we possibly could to sample the really cold, pristine, supercooled clouds. We also aimed the trajectories to try and sample the cold, dry sector of the clouds where these low, mid-level boundary layer clouds dominate and where we believe the climate models are having the problem. The Capricorn shows the cruise of the investigator here in the blue color. And we also had observations that was collected in a co-located DOE experiment called Marcus, where we put the Arm Mobile Facility on an Australian icebreaker, which supplied the various Australian Antarctic stations so that we got a fairly climatologically and seasonal representative set of data over about a 6-month time period. So I'm not going to have time to show you nearly all of the results that we got from this campaign, but I would like to just show you a little tidbit about this supercooled water. So here I'm showing some observations from the high spectral resolution LiDAR that was on the G5 aircraft as it was flying towards the south at an altitude of about 20,000 feet. And what I want to draw your attention to is in the upper panel here, I'm showing the volume depolarization ratio, where basically blue colors or low colors correspond to not much depolarization, corresponding to the presence of spherical drops that is associated with supercooled water. The lower panel shows the backscatter coefficient, which shows where you have clouds present. And I want to draw your attention to a lot of these fairly thin clouds that exist over the Southern Ocean. And I also want to draw your attention to this blue color, which shows a lot of them are supercooled at fairly cold temperatures. And we found a prevalence of these supercooled water clouds that it could occur in multiple layers, and they were quite thin, typically in the orders of hundreds of meters. So what my graduate student, John D'Alessandro, did is he took a look at all of the in-situ data that we collected from the G5 aircraft, because typically, in addition to doing the high-level flights over the clouds, in our return to Hobart, we would fly through the clouds, and he constructed probability distributions of the relative fraction of different phases as a function of temperature. So here we have temperature on the vertical axis and probability on the horizontal axis. The black line illustrates the number of cases. And what you see is that there's a large frequency of supercooled liquid water that is indicated by this red line at temperatures as cold as -20 degrees Celsius, which is quite a bit colder than the temperature of -15 degrees Celsius, which was our conventional knowledge of where we thought supercooled water would occur based on our observations of Arctic clouds. Interestingly, we also see that the ice phase is frequently observed with this blue color, fractions up to about 10%, even at temperatures as warm as -5 to 0 degrees Celsius. So we're further exploring what can be causing some of these trends. But another thing we looked at is we looked at the presence of generating cells. And this is a paper from Yang Wang, my graduate student, that was published last year. And here I'm showing a picture that taken by my graduate student, Joe Finland, from the window of the G5 aircraft. And what you can see is that these stratocumulus deck, it's not very homogeneous, but rather you can see tops of clouds that are percolating up above the top of the cloud. So what we do is we use the term generating cell to describe a region of small, locally high reflectivity at cloud top from which an enhanced reflectivity tail can emanate. So here I'm showing an example from the hypercloud radar of some of these cells, and you can see these areas of enhanced reflectivity with emanating streaks of precipitation beneath. So what Yang Wang looked at is he looked at how the microphysical properties inside these generating cells differed according to those outside the generating cells. So what he did, here I'm showing an example of an HCR radar image. And what he did was he identified a technique to define all of these generating cells using a mathematical technique called prominence, which is where you have a locally enhanced 4 dBz echo. And then he compared the microphysical properties that were measured inside the generating cells, which are depicted in the pink here, compared to those outside the generating cells that are depicted in the blue, using what are called violin plots, which are modified box and whisker plots. And a number of interesting results that he found is, first, the mean generating cell width was only about 395 meters, much narrower than generating cells we'd seen in previous studies in the Arctic and mid-latitudes. So these are only the length of about 4 football fields over which we have a lot of inhomogeneity. And further, when he looked at the total number concentrations, as you see in the pink compared to the blue, the total liquid water content seen in the pink compared to the blue, and the ice water contents, you can see that these tend to be larger inside the generating cells compared to outside the generating cells. But at the same time, the distinction isn't maybe as large as what we thought it would be Because of these small sizes and turbulent activities at the top of the cloud, it looks like that mixing is minimizing the differences between the generating cells and outside the generating cells. But nevertheless, the generating cells provide a favorable environment for growth by deposition and riming, just like we had observed in our previous mid-latitude and Arctic cases. Well, I'd like to leave time for questions, so I'd like to summarize. I'd like to say we've developed a greater understanding of the measurement uncertainties associated with in-situ cloud probes so that we're providing higher quality data than we were 10 or 15 years ago. We're developing stochastic parameterizations of ice microphysics that take into account different sources of uncertainty, such as measurement, statistical, and variability. We've developed these so far for size distributions and mass relationships, and they're starting to be implemented in ensemble models. And we've also used in-situ measurements of cloud properties in this and many other field campaigns that I could talk about to learn more about processes occurring in clouds. And what does the future hold? We're going to make observations in more regimes to learn more about processes affecting cloud properties. And this includes aerosol cloud interactions, which I really haven't talked much about today, but I could give a whole seminar on that as well. The key thing is the data has to be analyzed in a consistent manner, because otherwise varying air characteristics could be induced. And this is related to a study that is going on in the International Commission for Clouds and Precipitation. We're also developing parameterizations for terminal fall speed. My postdoc Andrew Zambo is developing that. And we're trying to separate dependence on all of these relations on environmental conditions from variability and uncertainty. And we'll also apply stochastic parameterizations in models to determine their impact. And we need to run it in more situations too, so we can understand how uncertainties in measured microphysics scale up to model predicted fields. So my final slide is, if you want to learn more about all of the different processes and projects that we've been involved with, I invite you to attend the International Conference in Clouds and Precipitation, which will take place 2 to 6th August. We had hoped that the world would be coming to Pune, India for this conference. It appears that the majority of the meeting will be a virtual meeting, so all the presentations will be online. So we'll be presenting several talks there or posters to talk more about our results, and I hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Dr. McFarquhar. So if anyone has any questions, they can either raise their virtual hand and I will unmute them, or they can ask a question in the chat and I will read it aloud. Or you can also chat me and ask to be unmuted, which Dr. Lee did for the first question. Dr. Lee, you should be unmuted now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can hear you, Zhenjing.
Hi, Greg. Thank you so much for giving talk. Very useful, very entertaining talk. I'd like to ask you, you are the person who probably have done the most aircraft observation in recent decades. And what is the future for measurement, such measurement? We can have a lot more, but we never have enough. The key is, can we quantify or characterize cloud microphysics by ambient environmental meteorological variables? Of course, this is we all refer to as parameterization of microphysics based on bulk variables. So how much, or which one of them will be possible based on your rich experience on Anvil?
Okay, that is a great question. And I believe at this stage, we do not have enough measurements. We need to get them in varying meteorological situations, especially areas where we're lacking observations over the Arctic. We still don't have enough observations over the Southern Ocean. There's a lot of oceanic regions where we're lacking observations, especially in very pristine areas, as well as polluted areas. I know at one time you and I talked about maybe some observational campaigns over China, and hopefully when the pandemic ends, maybe we can pursue more ideas of collaboration there. But I think there's a couple of reasons to be more optimistic that I may be able to answer your question maybe in another 10 years or so. First of all, we've gained a lot of information in the last 5 years just on how to process the data. These data are very complex to process, converting information from these photodiode arrays to a measured size distribution and properties. You have to deal with out of focus particles. You have to deal with particles that are edges of photodiode arrays. Different groups sometimes treat these issues differently. And when that happens, you might have differences, say, between a data set I provided versus a data set maybe Martina Kramer from Karlsruhe provided or Andy Heimsfield from NCAR, because we process the data in different ways. So we get together regularly to talk about this, to try and somehow come up with a golden standard for how we're going to process the data in much the same way model intercomparison studies are done. And the second thing is, I think in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe we can start to see more UAS observations and then collected more routines so we can get more statistics so that we can build up the type of statistics to answer your question. And much like the same way, with the ARM program, we had to get years and years of remote sensing observations to begin to see trends and how the cloud properties varied with environmental data. I hope we can do the same with clouds, in situ measurements. And just the other thing is, usually our in situ studies will continue to concentrate on processes so that we can look at ideas there, to help us understand the processes in addition to just getting measurements of the properties. But that is a great question.
Great, thank you so much.
So we have two people raising their hands, but I know one person has been waiting a bit. So this is a question from Ji Gong. They said, very inspiring talk. From your point of view, what are the best techniques for future satellite missions that are suitable to capture Southern Ocean cloud unique properties? Thanks.
Okay, that's a great question. We may be getting a little outside of my area of expertise. But, the key thing is, in terms of missions over the Southern Ocean, we had always thought over the Southern Ocean that there was a lot of supercooled water there. But if you look at a lot of the earlier studies of remote sensing retrievals from the Southern Ocean, you could get different results depending upon, whether you're looking at the Dardar algorithm or some other algorithm, so that we didn't have a lot of uncertainty really in what the phase distributions were. So our experiment over the Southern Ocean, I think, was very informative in showing that, yes, the satellite studies that said there was a lot of supercooled water there were correct. So what we need to do is we really need to have a lot of coverage. And, a key thing is the Southern Ocean can be very dark. We only did the observations in the summertime. We want to go back in the transition season so we can look at a time period where the phytoplankton blooms are changing, because we suspect that may be affecting the cloud properties. But also the winter is a big uncertainty, because in the winter you get a lot of very violent cyclones. We can't use visible techniques too much in the winter because it's very dark. So I think it's going to have to be a very integrated satellite mission. I really want something that can concentrate on getting good measurements of the water paths that are present there, because we have such a limited set of data from the in situ. We have very good measurements for evaluating satellite algorithms at the time we get them, but I would like to be able to get retrievals of cloud concentration, effective radius, water path over multiple seasons.
Thank you. Jigong also had a second question. How do you differentiate natural secondary ice generation from the splinter effect that is caused by hitting your cloud probe?
Great question. The key thing is really, this is, again, secondary ice crystal production is a major area of uncertainty. Typically, when we see the shattered artifacts, it's when there's very large crystals present, and we can, and they're very quick inter-arrival time. Of course, you can make the same argument with the secondary ice crystal production, that they could also be measured in a very short interarrival time. But I think you can look for a couple of different things. One is there was a paper by Paul Lawson a couple years ago where he actually had some very high resolution CPI images where he could see one of these spicules that was actually emanating off a particle from one of these events. So that's one way. But also the other way, I think with the shattered artifacts, when you have them present, it simply just dominates the signal. So, and also you'd look for when it occurs because, we know we need these large liquid water drops, maybe bigger than about 20 microns for secondary ice crystal production. So if we only get those small particles in conditions where we know from lab studies or theoretical studies where it might occur, then I think we could probably say we're seeing secondary ice crystal production. But if we get it in all possible conditions, then that's probably a shattered effect. Great questions.
Thank you. So now we are going back to verbal questions. Dr. Liang has his hand raised. Dr. Liang, you should be unmuted.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much for the great presentation. So I have one question which regarding how the data and the model can be used in the microphysics point of view. So I know, like, for example, the supercooled water and the CCN, these are two things which is very uncertain in modeling. So do you have any suggestion how this two part can be improved in the numeric modeling, especially do we need to consider this regime change? You have emphasized the differences among the different locations. So for the two, the supercooled water abundance and also the CCN, what we should do in the model?
Well, there's a few ideas I would give you here. One is we just need much better, we need to continue doing these comparisons. And I think, for limited times and limited areas, we should think about bin resolve simulations where we can possibly do them, which are maybe initiated by some more of the bin resolve simulations, because we have better activation spectra in that case. We know how the CCN numbers, say, depend on supersaturation because we have direct measurements of CCN. But then we can also compare results of the bin resolve simulations against the observations. Because, again, bin resolve simulations, they still have a large number of uncertainties in them. There are also a lot of constants in these bin resolve simulations that give a lot of uncertainties. And if we can't resolve them, how are we going to work with the bulk resolve schemes? And then the other answer to the question is, I've been thinking a lot in the past few months about Socrates too. And in terms of different regimes, I'm thinking the next rendition of Socrates should take place at the time of year when we're getting a change in the phytoplankton blooms, and do more of a Lagrangian experiment than the Eulerian experiment, which was our first experiment. So we do the flight one day, and then the next day, we track the same cyclone that we sampled the previous day, so we can get an idea of how it evolved. Hopefully, before or after it goes over one of these phytoplankton blooms, so we can start to get an idea better of, having an actual change of regime in our observations, so we can actually sample that rather than just having observations from different campaigns over different times of the year.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's a great idea. And we were looking for this data available. It's really important in this data.
Well, I'll tell you, Liang, anytime you want any of the data that we've collected and you want to run some simulations, I would be delighted to collaborate with you. It takes a lot of money to collect these data. It takes a lot of effort to process the data as well. I want to make sure that in addition to collecting more data, that we're getting total use out of the data that we have already collected. So, I also say that to the graduate students in the audience today, these data are available. If it's useful for your project, don't be afraid to reach out for help in using these data. I'd love to see them be used.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. So our next question is from Xiaowen Li. Xiaowen, you're unmuted.
Hey, thanks a lot for the talk, Greg. That was great. Just a quick comment on the Bing model. I run Bing models, and then Greg just provide A and B, right? For a Bing model, so for a bulk model, I would like to say you have maybe 10 knobs to tune. For a Bing model, you have 100, maybe 500. It's gonna be, I mean, it's gonna take a lot of detail analysis. If it might be useful because the in-situ analysis is the most detailed, and for me, I'd like to regard that as ground truth, because there's nothing else that's more true. But my question for you is, I haven't seen any. Have you ever done any analysis taking into account the vertical velocity? Like from a microphysical point of view, the changes of temperature, water vapor, those are all related to vertical velocity. If some trends can be seen from there, I wonder if it'll be more useful for some of the designing some of the parameters, especially more complicated ones. That, like, for me, vertical velocity might be more fundamental than temperature and water vapor. So that brings the next question is, I think there is a limit where in-situ airplane will be able to go. I don't know exactly what is the upper limit of the vertical velocity those airplanes being flying. I haven't seen any of those reports. So my question is, if there is a limit where you can go into for deep convections and very, very violent and turbulent clouds, do you think it is possible to extrapolate some of the relation to the deep ones, or what is a better way of handling those? Because those strong convections are the major contributor to a lot of the energy and storms.
Xiaowen, thank you for these great questions, and I think you've really highlighted about the next 10 to 20 years of work that needs to be done in cloud microphysics. So I'd like to just make a few comments on all of them. First of all, your point about the number of knobs you have to tune in the bin resolve scheme is very, very relevant. And the way that I see progress on that being made is through some laboratory studies. There are some fundamental unknowns about cloud microphysics that still need to be resolved, including more information on the collection efficiencies, more information on secondary ice crystal production, and a number of other things. And really, we need a lab facility to do some of those experiments that would probably give you better information on how to tune some of those knobs than we ever hope to get with our observational studies, because there you can actually observe processes. And one of the problems in the United States right now is Ray Shaw has a nice lab facility at MTU, but there's really not a lot of lab facilities. And unlike having national facilities to make aircraft measurements, like at NCAR, DOE, and NASA, there's no national facility to do lab work. And I think if that could be established, we might go a long way to getting some fundamental information. Your comment about vertical velocity, or question about vertical velocity, is also dead on. There can be a lot of dependence on vertical velocity. And yes, we do account that in a lot of our parameterizations. My former graduate student, Gina Mascio, and myself, we published a paper last year in QJRMS that shows the dependence of size distributions on vertical velocity in addition to temperature and ice water content. There's also an earlier study by McFarquhar and Black where we look at these. And vertical velocity is an extremely important feature because you have a lot of differences not only in the size distributions, but in terms of the bulk vertical velocities, depending upon whether you're in updrafts, downdrafts, or more stratiform regions. In terms of the range of vertical velocities sampled, yes, it is a major deficiency right now that we are not able to make in situ observations in deep convection. There was previously an aircraft from South Dakota that made some observations there. That was probably in the order of about 30 years ago. That was before my time in the field. NCAR was trying to outfit a new aircraft to do exactly that type of thing. I remember when I was planning the Pecan experiment, I was told that aircraft might be available in time for Pecan, which was conducted in 2015, which was a mid-latitude MCS experiment. And I was all excited about that. Unfortunately, that A-10 aircraft never worked out. And there's actually now, NSF is still looking into what type of aircraft that might be available to take those type of measurements. So I hope that it does come to bear that that ultimately takes place. So how do you get those observations? That's a huge uncertainty. Can you extrapolate? Well, until we have the measurements, I don't know whether we can extrapolate or not. So what you do is you look for those few incidences where maybe an aircraft accidentally went in an updraft a little bit larger than it actually wanted to go to. This can happen maybe in oceanic MCSs. We have the high ice water content, high altitude ice crystal experiments where we would go into a bit of updrafts, but in terms of, you know, an MCS, a continental MCS over Oklahoma in summer, an airplane is not going to go there of the type we currently have. There's just no way.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, right now, maybe model, I'm not sure, because model uses exactly the same processes for all the particle formation, barring we don't know the turbulence. That's another issue. But yeah, thanks so much. I totally agree with you on everything you said. Thank you.
But it's the same thing. In the Southern Ocean, you use the Arctic parameterizations, your models don't work. You use the same parameterizations in these big updrafts, they might not work.
Agreed, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that question. We do have another verbal question, but there's been some people that are waiting in the chat for a while. This one's from Ji Peng. They ask, have you measured the positive/negative ions or particles in the cloud and lightning as well?
That one is really outside of my area of expertise, so I would not be able to provide a coherent answer to that question.
Okay, no worries. We have a question. Did I just lose somebody? Was it Xiaowen Li who just asked the question?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, so their hand is still raised. So we have a text question from Mihan, and this is my last question that I have in the queue. So if anybody else has any last minute questions, they can throw them in. So this person asks, thanks for the talk. Greg, would you please elaborate a bit more on why the error in the particle mass estimation from 2D image is very large? How large is it?
Okay, well, why it is very large, it's because our airborne probes make a two-dimensional measurement of what is a three-dimensional body, which, even more complicated, can also have a varying density. So the way I like to think about this, the way I explain it to my students, is think about your human body. There are multiple two-dimensional images you could take of a human body. If you're looking directly above me, I'm going to look very small, right? I'm just going to be a little bit of a circle, maybe, I don't know, a diameter of about a foot, or yeah, about a foot. And if you look at me sideways, you're going to see that I'm about almost 6 feet tall, and you're just going to get a very different image of me. So if you were going to estimate my mass and you had no clue of what a human body looked like, you would get a very different image depending upon what framework you were looking. So when these particles go through the probe, they can also have various different shapes and they can have various different orientations. So, you know, we have to make guesses, and we also have to make guesses about their density in order to figure out the mass. So that is another reason why we like to have these measurements of bulk mass. Because if you have a measurement of bulk mass, then what you can do is, if you assume that mass is this relationship given by AD to the B, you can force those A and B coefficients, you can tune them so that what you get by integrating the size distribution matches the bulk mass. But, you know, that has weaknesses too. My graduate students, Sai Ding, published a paper last year where she showed that these A and B coefficients, they really aren't the same over a whole size distribution, but rather, you know, they can vary depending upon the size of the particle. So there's just a lot of uncertainty. So with this bulk mass probe, we can really reduce that uncertainty, but just with the images themselves, there's just a lot of uncertainty in how you go from a two-dimensional view to a three-dimensional particle, also where you don't know what the density is.
Thank you, Dr. McFarquhar. I think that is it for questions. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. This discussion was great, very inspiring. I'm getting tons of comments just saying that they're enjoying this. So they don't have a question, they just like it. As for everyone else, please join us again next week as our seminar series continues. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for the great questions. And hopefully in the next couple years, sometime I can be out to visit you. And also, if anybody has more questions, feel free to write me an email.